is the Silver and Black Today podcast, your source for Raiders news and information. Now, here's your hosts, swaggering boisterously.
All right, welcome back, everybody. This is podcast number 66, a special report. Today, obviously, the Raiders ended their 2018 season in a way that you wouldn't be surprised going back to the beginning of the year. Although the Raiders in their last 6 games going into the game in Kansas City today, 3-3, a 500 team over those 6 weeks. But the Chiefs were way too much. The Raiders did not come out firing on all cylinders and turn the ball over quickly, and soon found themselves behind and unable to catch up for many reasons. And we would talk about that. We talked about it the game prior this morning on the CBS Sports Radio show, Silver and Black Today, that runs 8 to 10 a.m. every Sunday, which you can hear in Las Vegas on CBS Sports Radio 1140, but also on radio.com worldwide. And it's been a long day. We also do the PG post-game show, which we talked a lot about the Raiders' performance today and the future. And, of course, the story that broke today, and that, of course, was that NFL Network analyst Mike Mayock has interviewed for the GM position with the Raiders. He confirmed that. There were other news reports. And then throughout the day, working the phones, not only myself and really and talking to 2 folks who really confirmed that with me and confirmed some other. And then, of course, our senior NFL writer, Hayden Nadolny, who joins us now from Australia. Hayden, how you doing tonight?
I'm doing very well, thanks, Scott. Thanks for having me on.
Of course. Not only tonight on my side, tomorrow, Monday morning, on your side of the world. And you also confirm, and that's the thing, we ran Hayden's weekly column Any Given Monday early. We ran it on Sunday night because of this breaking news. Not only, we didn't break it first, of course, but both Hayden and I have confirmed through sources that we have, and these are separate sources, that the interview did indeed happen, which we know, but also that Mayock has emerged as the leading candidate and could be named general manager of the Raiders here within the week. I had one source tell me it could be as early as midweek. And Hayden, what did you hear so far about timing on when this could all go down?
Well, realistically, it should happen by the end of the week. Obviously, they need to sort out all the contractual obligations, and then Mayock has his contractual obligations with the NFL in terms of his TV deal with the NFL Network, so he needs to sort all that out. And but this could really, the trigger could be pulled on it at any time, because the Raiders have interviewed a minority candidate, so they have adhered to the Rooney Rule, which means that they can hire Mayock at any point. So look, John Gruden doesn't muck around. He likes to get things done quickly, and I would expect that now that Gruden's going to be putting his off-season executive hat on, now that the season is over, that this is going to be done very shortly.
Yeah, and it makes sense, right? Because you have to, with an NFL season, when you're not going to be in the playoffs, clearly the attention turns rapidly to the NFL draft, player evaluation, to on the roster. Remember, not only do they have to prepare to bring new folks in, whether they be free agents or amateurs via the draft in April, which seems like it's a far way off, but it's not, because there's a lot of things that have to happen between now and then. But also you have a current roster, and whoever you bring in as general manager, even though that position will change from what Reggie McKenzie did, and we'll talk about that in a second, you still need to evaluate what's on the roster. What did you learn, to me, really after Week 12? Because that's when we saw the team progress, and we saw the team, I think, really buy into and start to run both John Gruden's system on offense and then, of course, Paul Guenther's system on defense. Whoever you hire has to come in and help you evaluate those guys, too. That's just as important, is it not?
Oh, of course. Player personnel in terms of evaluating isn't just in terms of, okay, what do we need to acquire, but it's rather what do you currently have. So you need to be able to search and be able to evaluate the current talent on the roster, because if you can't do that, you're not going to be able to get anywhere no matter how many plugs that you try to fill. You're just going to be continuously chasing those plugs, and it's like a dog chasing its tail. You just continually do it over and over again.
That's right. And we've seen the Raiders over the last 7 weeks have sort of a one step forward, two steps back, but certainly make progress. And you talk about it in your column Any Given Monday over on silverandblacktoday.com. You talk about some of that progress, and so I invite people to go read that column. The traffic already on the website, as you can imagine, with the Mayock story is going bonkers, and so people are reading that. But make sure you read that. Read all of Hayden's column. Of course, the first part of his column is around this breaking news around Mike Mayock, and so that leads it off. But there's some other great tidbits in there, and your view on some of the talent that's currently on the roster, including the progress. Now, let's go right into Mike Mayock. Now, we know, Hayden, that with John Gruden in place with a 10-year contract, John Gruden is making the calls. So whoever was going to come in as the next general manager of the Raiders was going to have a different position. It was going to be much more of a talent evaluation. And with all due respect to Mike Mayock, who I like, remember, I'm a Notre Dame football fan, so I used to listen to Mike do color and then sideline for the Notre Dame Fighting Irish football team on NBC before he moved on to the NFL Network. So I like Mayock a lot. I'm not trying to disrespect him at all by saying this, but what you really need is sort of a super scout, somebody who's going to be able to inform Gruden, that has his trust, that's going to be able to evaluate both talent coming out of college but also talent on the current roster as well. What is it about Mike Mayock, Hayden, that makes him an appealing candidate for Mark Davis, John Gruden, and the Raiders?
There's multiple facets that go into that question. So realistically, there are very few people who know the draft as intimately as Mike Mayock does. So in terms of analyzing the draft, you're not going to come across someone who knows their stuff more than him. And that's not just because he's on TV and he has a bit more exposure in that regard, but this is what he does for a living. He analyzes the draft day in, day out, and he's been doing that for years. And if you look at his track record, he has a very good one at that in terms of picking players. And most importantly, he's not afraid to go against the grain. So I remember, for instance, back in 2008 when Darren McFadden and Chris Johnson were the top two running backs in the draft, and everyone, 99% of experts supposedly had McFadden as the number one back. Well, Chris Johnson was Mayock's number one back, and we saw that barely 3 years later, he was a 2,000-yard running back for Tennessee. So we can see that Mayock, I can go on with multiple other examples, but he does have his fair share of misses as well. But on the whole, he's a very good draft evaluator. And that's the number one thing.
Well, and that's the thing, too. I think I always remind people, Hayden, that when it comes to the draft, everyone keeps saying the Raiders have to be perfect in the draft. And I understand that when it comes to first-round picks, you got to deliver, right? Especially with what they traded away in Khalil Mack and Amari Cooper this year. So I get that sentiment when it comes to the first round, but I don't care if you're the best draft guru in the world. You never hit on 100% of the guys. So, of course, Mayock's had his misses as an analyst. There's no question about that. But I think most people, and the feedback we're getting, we put up a poll on Twitter before we went on the air, and we asked, how do you feel about Mayock doing this? And just about 250 votes so far, and 75% say they love it, 13% say not sold, which I think is 10% of people are always going to be not happy, and then 12% were like, I'm not sure, which is natural. So overwhelmingly, Raider Nation on Twitter, responding to our poll, said they love it. Now, Mike Mayock, too, not only does he have that reputation of evaluating talent really well, but I think one of the important things here, and you mentioned it in your column, Hayden, is he has a history with the Raiders going back to Al Davis. Tell us a little bit about that.
Roughly a decade ago, he was interviewed by Al Davis for a similar position, not necessarily the general manager position, but he was interviewed for a senior level executive with the Raiders. And the interview went very well. Between Al Davis and Mayock, they both have at the time, they had a great mutual respect for each other right up until the moment of Davis's passing. And for whatever reason, it just never worked out. They could never come to an agreement on the exact title that they were looking for and what Al Davis was looking for in an executive and what Mayock really wanted to do at that time. And Mayock's been called out by a number of teams before to work for them, and he's declined. He's been quite happy to continue with his role at the NFL Network. So I think that this is quite a big deal now that he wants to come out of the fire, and he's going to, in all likelihood, by the end of this week, he'll be an Oakland Raider.
Yeah, we're talking to Hayden Nadolny, our senior NFL writer at silverandblacktoday.com, also a contributor here not only on the podcast but on our CBS Sports Radio show on Sundays as well. Now, I'm always a fan of Mayock. I told you going back to the Notre Dame days, but also Mayock on NFL Network hosts a show called Path to the Draft, which I love too. It's a great program. And this is a guy who lives and breathes the draft as well. So from a talent evaluator perspective, here's a guy who can come in right away. And as you mentioned, with those draft picks over the next 2 years, the Raiders have a multitude of 5 first-round draft picks and others. Here's a guy who can come in. He already knows the 2018 college football season going into 2019 draft. He already is intimately aware of everyone coming out on both sides of the ball. So to me, Hayden, he could jump right in if he is hired and this all works out and they're able to cross the T's and dot the I's. He's able to come in right away. And there's a guy, John Gruden, has comfort with, trusts immediately, and exactly the sort of guy that he's looking for, correct?
Oh, exactly. Gruden's behind in terms of being able to stay on track in terms of the draft. So he's been the head coach all season, and as much as you can try to play the role of top level executive, the head coach, the roster manager, all of that, you just simply can't put the necessary time that you need to into the draft. And as much as he's got the better part of 3.5 to 4 months to do it, that's not enough time to be ready for the draft. And having a guy like Mayock he's drafting, or not, I shouldn't say he's drafting, but he's looking at these guys multiple years before they even become eligible for the draft. So he knows the draft as good as anyone. He's going to be able to have the Raiders more than up to speed in that area, which means that they're going to be able to hit the ground running, which is so important when you've got 3 first-round picks this year.
Well, and him being a draftnik and a player evaluator kind of, I mean, some people will call him a guru. I don't use that word very often, but he is someone who's intimately informed and knows the landscape of college football and pro football through his work at the NFL Network. So I believe that this would be a great hire because you're not going to get the traditional general manager. That's not what the Raiders are looking for. John Gruden is looking for someone, and again, from what we've heard from the people that we talk to inside the organization and inside the NFL, this is what he wants. He wants somebody that he knows can back him up on opinions that he has and also bring to the table information and evaluation that he can then make the best informed decision that he can make now as the de facto leader of the Raider organization from the football side to do that. Is there any downside, do you see, with Mayock in that position with the Raiders should it happen?
No, the only thing is his lack of experience. He doesn't have any necessary full-on front office experience in that type of role. So he's been able to make the decisions in terms of his evaluating, but whether those evaluations are going to be able to lead to pulling the trigger on certain people, because it's much easier to be pulling the trigger when you have no responsibilities attached to it. So you can shoot from the hip as much as you want, but it's going to be very interesting to see how this draft goes. If it's a Mike Mayock draft, that's for sure.
Right, and to me, one of the things, the criticisms of John Gruden as it stands today, coming off a mostly negative year as far as fans are concerned. Again, fans don't necessarily know the evaluation side, nor do they know the business side of things. And you're coming off a year where 2 very popular players on the Raider roster were traded, others were cut, let go. And what's remarkable to me, though, is the Raiders finished with 4 wins, okay? After all that's happened this year, trading away Khalil Mack, trading away Amari Cooper, all the roster turnovers and the injuries on the offensive line and the starting rookies who Colton Miller and Brandon Parker, we saw again today, Brandon Parker struggled, as did Colton Miller at times. Those guys, they still delivered 4 wins. Now, I know that's not acceptable. It's about getting to the playoffs and winning a Super Bowl. But to have the Raiders just go backward 2 games from last year when they were 6-10 is pretty telling, I think, because this team played for John Gruden towards the end of the year. They bought in. They didn't have enough talent to win consistently, and they probably could have won a couple more games if it weren't for some key errors, including by Derek Carr early in the season. But certainly you have to look at Mayock saying to himself, do I leave this cushy job at NFL Network where he works very, very hard, of course, but the opportunity to work with John Gruden, the opportunity to work with the Raider brand, the opportunity when you look at it from the perspective of having, as it stands right now, just under $90 million in cap space and all those draft picks, is it any wonder that Mike Mayock looks at this opportunity and says, boy, this is something that I really would like to consider?
It's interesting because most NFL GMs that would want any sense of power, they're not going to be able to go for this job, or this job isn't going to necessarily appeal to them because they're not going to have the number one stranglehold on the decision making. Because at the end of the day, this is John Gruden's team. He's going to be the one pulling the trigger. But for someone to have their opinion heavily swayed, for someone who wants their voice to be heard in an organization quite highly, this role as the general manager, and we're not even sure if it's going to be called the general manager because the Raiders have put out their wording that it might not necessarily be that. But whoever the replacement for general manager Reggie McKenzie is, if that is Mayock, it's going to be interesting because at the end of the day, what you're going to be able to find is that Mayock, he's not going to be the lead man, but he's going to be the one that is Gruden's right-hand man. And when it comes to executives making decisions, Gruden's going to be able to put all the pieces of the puzzle together. Contrary to what so many people believe, he actually is delegating quite a few of his tasks to other people. This means that he's collating the information. He's kind of letting people do their roles. And a lot of people think that it's just Gruden, whatever he wants to do, and he's doing it. Well, if that was the case, nothing would get done. And I mean, if that were the case, Reggie McKenzie would never have been the one that pulled the trigger on the Khalil Mack trade, in which Reggie McKenzie was the one responsible for giving up the 2nd round and the 5th round pick for pick swaps in the 3rd and the 6th round, respectively. Yeah,
and it's interesting too. I mean, if you think of Mayock, is there any clues from the type of player that Mayock seems to be high on in all his reporting and the things he talks about in draft analysis, and he's talked about through the course of this season, both college and pro? Is there any clues that we can get from that information, Hayden, that might lead us to see what kind of direction he might lead John Gruden?
Yeah, so in terms of his wide receivers, just over the history that Mayock's been giving his rankings on NFL.com, he absolutely prefers receivers who have a bit of size about them. So he likes that Mike Evans type. I mean, a lot of people would like to have a Mike Evans on their team. So, but Mike Evans, 6'4", 225, that type of being able to box you out, throw it up there on the fade route, back shoulder, and you'll go get it. That's the type of receiver he likes. But ultimately, Mayock is really about drafting football players. He doesn't. He's quite the opposite of what Al Davis was, which is interesting, I guess, when you look at Davis interviewed him back over a decade ago, because Mayock's not so much concerned about the 40 time, the vertical jump, how many times you bench press 220. He really is all about, is this guy a football player who's going to be able to produce for me on Sunday?
Yeah, no, and the one thing too, if you read anything about Mike Mayock, I've been reading about him all day. And trying to find sort of feature stories that give you some insight into the man outside of just his work, his body of work in the media, including on the draft. And that is the one thing that's consistent that I see that people say about him is the fact that he is incredibly smart and he is diligent in doing his homework and the research that he does. And that's exactly, in my view, the reason why I think that it would be a good move is because if he's got John Gruden's ear, and he's that astute at looking at talent. Again, he's not going to hit on every single player, but I think this is the type of guy that is perfect for the role the way that they have established it, because he is a guy who's going to come in and do what he's doing now, just doing it for an NFL team. Of course, he's got to learn some things as well about working inside an organization in the NFL, but certainly he's somebody who Gruden's going to be able to trust immediately, and he's going to be able to make the best decision based on that information without him having to scour the draft. And for all those people who criticize Gruden for his past work in player personnel, you now have somebody there. Now, Mayock could go in and Gruden doesn't listen to him. I don't think that happens. I think if Mayock is a guy that they're fast-tracking to get in there in the next week, that tells me John Gruden believes strongly that he's going to help him evaluate what he needs to do to get this team to the winning column.
Oh, of course. There's no way that Mike Mayock would go in there if he didn't expect to have some sort of power with John Gruden's ear. He would have to be someone that John Gruden is going to explicitly trust, maybe not necessarily to pull the final trigger, but in someone that is going to have a major say in how the rebuild goes for this team.
It does. And we, again, go over to silverandblacktoday.com and read Hayden's Any Given Monday, his weekly column, entitled Signs Point to Mayock as New Raiders GM. Hayden talks about this more in depth. He also runs through some of the things that we learned today about the Raiders' game against the Chiefs and some other things, too, especially about some of the players that are on the roster that may remain and should remain there as well as some of the questions that remain. And this is a short podcast. We just wanted to make sure we got Hayden on with this breaking news and that we were able to talk about it and move forward. But Hayden, I mean, we saw today, just quickly, your comments on the game against the Chiefs today.
Well, I thought it was a pretty bad performance, but realistically, they're going on the road against a very good team. Derek Carr does not have a good history in Kansas City, so you couldn't really expect much. I didn't expect them to have 4 turnovers on the first 4 drives, so that was just embarrassing.
It was.
That miscommunication between Carr and Cook that led to the pick 6, that's just an abomination. And I quietly hope that it brings his price down, maybe one or 2 million, in free agency, because you throw that tape up there, no one's going to want to sign him.
Yeah, and to me, the one thing before I let you go is I really was looking for the offensive line and the young tackles, Miller and Parker. They had a good game last week, and I really wanted to see them put together 2 games. Especially now, the Chiefs have 2 guys up front that are stellar, that are having career years. But overall, that Chiefs defense is next to last in the league. So I really wanted to see them string 2 games together. It didn't happen, which to me points to the fact that perhaps we could see. I've not heard anything, but we could maybe see if there's any coaching changes, further coaching changes for the Raiders on that staff. It could be our long offensive line with Tom Cable, who I know with the fans has never been a popular choice, but we'll see. I know the Raiders will continue to make a lot of changes as they move towards 2019 and preparing for this offseason, both free agency and from a draft perspective. Hayden, thanks for joining me again, man, and we'll get you on again real soon. I appreciate it.
No, for sure. You have a happy new year. Finish 2018 in style, mate.
You do. You will hit the new year before we will. So celebrate there for me, and I will celebrate here for you in Las Vegas.
7 hours and 5 minutes.
That's right.
We'll be in 2019.
That's right. Again, Hayden Nadolny, our senior NFL writer at silverandblacktoday.com. Check out his column, Any Given Monday. Today's column already going crazy, so make sure you check that out. Boy, been a long day. We started this morning, 8 a.m. Pacific, on CBS Sports Radio with Silver and Black Today on the air, and then finish it up here with this news on Mike Mayock. Podcast 66 in the books. Thank you guys for joining us. We'll keep you abreast of all that is going on in Raider Nation. Make sure you listen, subscribe. And again, thanks to Hayden Nadolny, and thanks to all of you for making us what we are. We appreciate it. You've been listening to Silver and Black Today here on Spreaker. We'll talk to you real soon.